Hello, everyone. Most of you know me at least a little bit. I'm Larry Sorrell. I'm the director of the New York State Zoo at Thompson Park. This is the second of what we hope to be an ongoing series of a few times a year. We're not sure exactly how it's going to eventually settle out. Right now, it's looking like a fall and a spring presentation, the way it works, about issues relevant to conservation. May not always be zoo directly, but it's going to be talking about conservation in either New York State or eventually I'd like to see us get into a little bit more global issues. The first one was Dr. Jeff Wyatt. He was the veterinarian at Seneca Park Zoo for many, many years, and he talked about sturgeon. So I'm following that theme a little bit with Dr. DiVincenti, who is now the veterinarian at Seneca Park Zoo. I hired Louis just before I left, then abandoned him. And he still agreed to come up, so we've salvaged the relationship. I'm not going to tell you all of Louis' credentials because I don't know them all by heart. But fundamentally, very much into animal welfare, animal wellness in a broad concept in animals and human care. It's an important thing and it's a fundamental thing that we just assume we do, but I'm not sure that we do as well as we can, and we certainly don't have, to date, extensive science supporting objective parameters for doing it. It's one of the things that we have to continually be aware of and improve upon as our knowledge improves. So, Dr. DiVincenti, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a little bit more background on me. So I went to veterinary school at LSU because I grew up in New Orleans, and then moved to Rochester to do a lab animal residency at the U of R, and it was also we also took care of the zoo at that time. Now it's shifted into a full-time veterinary position at the zoo. And so a lot of my background or my interest in animal welfare as a distinct discipline comes from that background of lab animal medicine, where we're really using animals to advance human care, human medical care, and so we're doing things that maybe aren't the best for the animals, but for a greater purpose, and trying to figure out how we can make it the best possible experience for the animals, recognizing the reality of what we're doing to them, and then translating that into what we do at the zoo with holding animals in captivity. And then as a veterinarian, certainly there are issues with animals and the way humans relate to them or treat them in every relationship that we have, from dogs and cats that are used for pets to the animals that we eat. So there are all these welfare issues in the way that we treat animals that sort of frame my background as a veterinarian, and certainly as a zoo vet. So today we're going to talk about animal welfare, but sort of framing it in this idea of happiness. And so we tend not to think about animals as feeling happy, or tend to shy away from using those feelings words for animals for lots of different reasons that we'll talk somewhat about. But when we talk about welfare, that's really what it drills down to is happiness for the animals. So animal welfare is our top priority at an accredited zoo for sure, and at most zoos, what we're doing is for the animals, and it frames every decision that we make. And so this is the ACA's, our zoo accrediting authorities, position statement on animal welfare. So we have an ethical responsibility to ensure the well-being of the animals in our care. And sort of what Larry was saying, or alluding to, the next step to that is we don't always know how to create the best welfare for our animals. So in addition to that ethical responsibility for well-being, providing well-being for the animals, we have a scientific responsibility for figuring out what that actually means and what really is important to the animals themselves. So if we're going to talk about welfare, what is animal welfare, or what is good welfare? So what do you guys think about what welfare means, or what does welfare mean to you when you think of animal welfare?
This is interactive, so feel free.
And I work with animals, so I can outweigh.
Absence of disease is one thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Active diet.
24/7 access to healthcare.
Okay.
Water and shelter.
Okay.
Some sort of stimulation that makes them do what they would do if they were in a natural habitat.
Yeah, so behavioral opportunities. So notice, I think that's really interesting that the first like 3 or 4 things were all like really basic physical things, like veterinary things. And then we got behavior. Anything else?
Having conspecifics with them.
Yeah. So social groupings for social animals, normal social groupings. Yeah. Anything else? So it turns out that welfare is a really difficult thing to define. And so it's one of these things where that we sort of know it when we see it. And so this is a rhino at Seneca Park Zoo, and so this is his old exhibit on the left, and we just built this exhibit on the right. So if you're just looking at these 2 pictures, which animal or which presents the opportunity, the better opportunity for good welfare? The one on the right? Yeah. I hope we just spent $10 million, right? So I hope so.
Anybody says left,
Yeah.
you're in the wrong room.
Right. But it's a lot more than that. So that rhino lived in the exhibit on the left for 10 years before he moved. Did he have poor welfare there before? Maybe not, maybe so, but maybe not. Maybe our program was sufficient that we made up for the deficits in the facility. And of course that's much nicer, and it's summer when that picture is taken, he's outside. And so what if that was the inside molding to that outside? And what does that mean for his experience and what he experiences, recognizing that he lives in Rochester and that he's supposed to live in Africa? So is it okay that he just had, if that was his inside for 4 months out of the year and that's the outside for the rest of the time? Is that a balance that we can work out? But for sure, that's a better, we project that that's a better welfare experience for that animal than the one on the left. Yeah. So welfare is a really difficult concept to define because there's so many, we have so many biases as part of it, especially with the way that we relate to animals and the way that we use animals and the way that we experience animals in our lives. We have a really complicated relationship with them. So some we love, some we hate, some we eat, right? And so from when people are very, very young, they have these biases towards animals, so it's really hard for them to get sort of, for us to look at a welfare situation with animals and come at it from like a first pass view, because we already have these biases that are ingrained in us, and there's so much societal, economic, religious maybe connotations to the way we care for animals that it's really hard for us to look at a situation and judge it without bias. So this is AZA's definition of animal welfare, the zoo accrediting organization. And so I was saying earlier that they took the welfare committee, so their name is the welfare committee, and so one of their first things was to define what welfare is. It took them 7 years to come up with this definition. And it doesn't actually define it, it says it refers to something else. So animal welfare refers to an animal's collective physical, mental, and emotional state over a period of time. It also refers to an animal's ability to cope with the conditions in which it lives. And that's a really important concept when we're thinking about welfare, and we'll talk a little bit more about, is that we need animals just like people, we need them to be able to adapt to different challenges, because there will be negative things, there will be challenges, and not all negative is bad. And so as part of this, we need animals to be able to cope with different conditions, different situations as part of their normal lives. And so it's also really important to remember what welfare isn't, or to recognize what welfare isn't. And so when I'm talking to people that care for animals, when you start talking about welfare, we have a tendency to get a little bit defensive. And so it's really important to recognize that animal welfare is not animal care. It's not what we do and what we provide for animals. It's not our intention. So we can have the best intentions, we can be providing the best environment that we can, and an animal can still have poor welfare. So it's not an indictment or questioning of what we're doing. But when we're talking about welfare, we're talking about that animal's experience of the situation, not what we're doing. So that's really important. So have you guys heard about the 5 freedoms? Yeah, you guys have talked about those. So they came out of the Bramble Commission in the early 60s. This is a really basic framework for animal welfare. It was really transformative at the time in the mid-60s because it was the first time we systematically described animals as having emotions or feelings in response to their environments. And it was the first time we really used this word freedom, which is a really provocative notion for humans in reference to animals. So freedom from thirst and hunger, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from fear and distress, and freedom to express normal behaviors. What do you guys notice about these, or what do you think about these in terms of animal welfare?
I would want to include enrichment in the 5th one.
Yeah. So enrichment as an opportunity. Yeah.
Especially when you're talking about normal behaviors.
Right. Hold on to that.
Okay.
We'll talk.
Sorry.
We'll talk. Yeah, but good. What do you think in terms of if we achieved all of these, what kind of welfare do you think an animal might have? Like awesome?
They would have decent welfare.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't necessarily be, just not having the bad things doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing great.
Exactly. So it's real. So this was the 60s, and it was talking about food animals, farm animals. So it was really like cutting edge for the time, but it's really basic in terms of where we are now, sitting here in 2019, or what we should be. So, and for the most part, at least 4 out of the 5 are negative. So freedom from something bad. That only gets us so far. The 5th one gives us a little bit opportunity for more positive welfare state, but they're really basic. So good. So when we're talking about welfare, we're talking about measuring it on a continuum from poor to good. And so an animal, just like a person, might shift back and forth depending on what's going on. And so if I ask you how you're doing right now, you might answer in lots of different ways. And there's a lot of different inputs that are going into that. So if you just had a cookie and you like that, that might push you up a little bit more. If these chairs are uncomfortable, that might push you down. So you shift along this continuum of good to poor over time. And we want to be better than adequate, right? We want to be better than okay. So we want to really try to push up into those positive states of welfare versus just the absence of negative. So that's where we're trying to go with welfare. So when we're talking about happiness and this idea of a positive affective state, recognizing that initial 5 freedoms framework is really just the absence of negative. A newer way of looking at it is getting away from just basic things and thinking about providing animals with a life worth living is the terminology that's come out. So we want them not just to have adequate states of welfare, but we want to provide a good life that's worth living. And so because of that, we've come up with a different framework, or an updated framework for the 5 freedoms. And we call these the opportunities to thrive, the 5 opportunities to thrive. And so it really puts the impetus back on the animal to have the experience. And so it makes it more animal-centered. So the things that we're going to provide will give the animal the opportunity to have a well-balanced diet, to self-maintain, for the opportunity to have optimal health, the opportunity to express species-specific behavior. And that's where things like enrichment come in, where we're setting up an animal in a way that it can express those behaviors. And then we'll talk a little bit about choice and control. And these last 2 are the really big possibilities or big opportunities for us to provide animals things that make them happy. And this is Lou. He's our hyena at the zoo. He's 26 years old, so he's the oldest hyena in North America, which is really cool. Still doing really well. So when we're talking about welfare and assessing welfare, we divide up our assessments into looking at two different things. So when we first started looking at welfare, we were focusing on these resource-based assessments, or so the inputs we call them. So that's the physical facility and what we do, some of these animal care type things. So looking at exhibit size, the social group, she said was important, different types of enrichment, a good diet, shelter, having animals in an appropriate climate for them is important, we know. But again, all of those just create the opportunity for the animal to have good welfare. It doesn't necessarily mean that they do. So what's better is to look at these animal-based assessments, so looking at outputs, so how the animal's experiencing that environment. So we can measure, there's physiological measures, so we can say they're not experiencing disease, or if they do have some disease, they're getting appropriate treatment. Or there are behavioral outputs that we can look at, so they are demonstrating some of those species-specific behaviors or species-appropriate behaviors. So sort of the big three ways that we look at animal welfare to assess it are looking at these three circles that all interplay with each other. So body has to do with physical health, so that's sort of the veterinary care stuff that's really easy to measure, or tends to be easier to measure because it's really objective, so we can tell if an animal is sick or not, if an animal has a high heart rate or not, or if a blood value is not right. Those are relatively easy to measure. The other two are a little bit more subjective, so behavior, which we'll talk more about, and then the feelings part. And which of these circles you make bigger is a value judgment, right? Mm-hmm. So as a veterinarian, I might think being free of disease is the most important thing for an animal to have good welfare, to the detriment of maybe the ability to express some natural behavior, or to have a positive mental state. And certainly the bottom two, looking at behavior and feelings, are indirectly measured. So we can't ask an animal how it feels, and so we have to indirectly measure that. So we lose something, right, when we're applying that and when we're interpreting it and putting our own biases on it. Does that make sense? Great. So I'm going to use elephants as an example as we talk more about some of these things, and because elephants have a really there's actually a lot of information about elephants because they're so high profile. And a couple of years ago, well, the research was published maybe 2 years ago, but it was a 3 to 5 year study for most of it. This is called the Elephant Welfare Initiative. Have you guys heard about this or talked about this? So it was the largest, most collaborative zoo welfare science study ever, looking at almost every elephant in AZA accredited zoos to really try to figure out what mattered to the elephant. So when we talk about welfare, we're talking about individual animals, but sometimes it's really useful and really helpful for us in zoos where we typically have really small numbers to use sort of an epidemiology approach and try to figure out what matters from a bigger population standpoint. And so that's what this study did. And so there are some really interesting things about that we'll talk about as we talk more about what makes elephants happy in the zoo. So body, physical health, so that essentially means the provision of adequate veterinary care, which we are pretty good at now in zoos. So we can monitor that really easily. We can objectively look at disease rates, mortality rates, that sort of thing, how animals reproduce. And it's more, and again, as we try to raise the bar for welfare and give animals an opportunity to experience optimal health and optimal well-being, it's more than just physical exams. It's under anesthesia. It's inviting the animals to participate in their own health care. So our elephants are trained to put give us different body parts so we can take x-rays, as elephants in captivity tend to have foot problems, right? So we can take x-rays of them. So this is one of our elephants, Moki, that's trained to put her foot out of through the bars, and we can take x-rays of it. And then we're doing acupuncture on our penguins as an opportunity for them to, this is Judy, she's 24 years old, so she's pretty geriatric, so she's got some arthritis. She's on a few different drugs and still has some lameness, so again, giving another opportunity through some non-traditional veterinary care to give her a better quality of life. So she doesn't necessarily enjoy the needles, so she's anesthetized, but it's actually a really smooth process, and she wakes right up and seems to be better. So that's the veterinary care part of it, the physical health part. And so because veterinary care is relatively easily monitored, we focus on that as being a big part of welfare, not recognizing these other parts that maybe equally are more important. And this only gives, providing veterinary care, adequate veterinary care, only provides the opportunity for the animal to do these other things that actually do promote a positive welfare state. So the next part of welfare that we talk about is behavior. And in welfare, when we talk about behavior, we use this term telos. Have you guys heard that term before? In terms of welfare, you guys are shaking your heads. So what's where have you heard it before?
I think I've heard it mentioned, but I don't know. I've heard the word.
Yeah.
I don't know about in regards to welfare. But
Yeah. Back row. You were shaking your head too.
I've never seen that.
Yeah. All right. So telos, and the way that Aristotle used it in terms of philosophy, was the inherent purpose of each thing. So like the telos of a seed is to become a tree. So what each thing is meant for. It comes from the Greek meaning end or result. And so when we talk about it with welfare, we talk about the telos of an animal. So what is its purpose, or what is our intrinsic behaviors that are important to it. So like the telos of a bird is to fly. And we sort of recognize what's really, so it really harkens back to an animal's state in nature, and natural behaviors are really important. So if we think about things like birds flying, or elephants roaming, or living in these complex social groups, that's really important to what makes them who they are. And so we tend to use that a lot in the zoo to compare what we're doing, what our animals are doing in the zoo to what they might do in the wild, and use that as an assessment for their welfare. And that goes back many decades. So this is a quote: the standard by which a zoo animal is judged should be according to the life it leads in the wild. And so that is a fairly straightforward way to look at welfare and judge welfare in the zoo. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Certainly the zoo is not the wild, and we can't recreate that. But the question is, do wild animals really have good welfare? And we as people tend to really have this romantic view of the wild, and really anything that's wild we think is good. But there are challenges, certainly in the wild. And so does this elephant have that great of a welfare that's hunted for its tusks? Probably not, right? And so certainly when we think of the zoo, and we're challenged by, like, we don't want to use the word captive, but certainly any animal, even in the wild, is confined to some degree, right? So there's climatic confinements. There's, depending on where they live in the world, there might be humans around them that are confining them. Their food source might be confining them to a certain location. So this idea of confinement, every animal, even in the wild, is confined. So when we're talking about welfare, and then when we're talking about welfare behaviors, most of the behaviors that we think about in animals that are really important, or that we think are important, aren't that important to the animal. They do them because they have to. So they're stimulus-driven behaviors. So an elephant, one of the things that came out of the Elephant Welfare Initiative is recognizing that we care about the size of elephant exhibits as a huge problem, and that we perceive it as a huge problem that elephants are in these really small enclosures and they might walk 40 miles in a day. But elephants in the wild that aren't, that don't have extreme resource limitations don't walk 40 miles in a day. They only walk that much because they have to. And so when elephants are in these habitats that are really resource rich, they walk pretty similar distances to elephants that are in zoos. And what came out of the Elephant Welfare Initiative is that it doesn't correlate, the distance that elephants walk in zoos doesn't correlate to the size of the exhibit, actually. So comparing these exhibits that are really small to the really big zoo exhibits, like that are acres, elephants in zoos that are in these acre size exhibits don't necessarily walk more than these elephants in these smaller exhibits. What it is linked to is food predictability. So in zoos that the elephants can't predict when they're going to get fed, those elephants walk more than elephants in zoos where the elephants are fed on a predictable, regular schedule, which is how they walk in the wild too, right? So if where food is predictable, they're going to stick around. Where food is not predictable, they're going to walk more. So that's the correlate. So it doesn't matter necessarily what size the exhibit is. To the elephant, what matters is predictability, food predictability. So when we're talking about, if we go back to the 5 freedoms and talking about the wild versus captivity, see pretty quickly if these are the things that we think provide just adequate welfare, the wild is pretty challenged for all of these, right? Maybe the 5th one, the freedom to express normal behaviors, is the one that the wild does well, but these other 4, it doesn't. There are certainly challenges in the wild for animals with those freedoms. A good zoo meets those 4 and maybe limits the expression of normal behaviors. A really excellent zoo for a lot of species probably doesn't even limit the expression of normal behaviors. And so that's really where we're trying to go with zoos, trying to meet these freedoms in a way that the wild doesn't, and recognizing that even though animal behavior in the zoo might be different, it's not necessarily bad if you think about it from the animal's point of view. So is that required for elephants, that long distance, and do these elephants want to be walking across that dusty plain? Is it important to them to walk across it? Maybe not. Maybe they're walking because they have to. And to give another example, tigers and large carnivores in zoos at a pretty significant degree exhibit the stereotypical pacing. And do you guys talk about stereotypies and that sort of thing in your program? So you know what stereotypies are. So tigers, polar bears are sort of the prototypical animals that do this. So it tends to be large carnivores that tend to walk more in the wild. So we think maybe we put them in these smaller exhibits and that then they want to walk more. So it's a locomotion because they want to walk. They probably don't want to walk that much, right? It probably has to do more with food distribution. And so there have been studies looking at food predictability for these carnivores, and that seems to be the biggest way to impact it. So this is something that we did last summer, that our pre-vet student last summer did, as sort of a pilot study looking at our tigers pacing. And I just want to show you some of the data. And so it's a student she's a pre-vet student, so she's there to do like veterinary stuff. And because I'm into welfare, they have to do some welfare stuff too. So she's helping me do like clinical stuff too. So she's doing this on the side. So it's very small numbers, but it's still interesting as pilot data to do more that we're doing more with now. So she hung out in front of the tiger exhibit and every minute wrote down what the tiger was doing. And then to analyze it, we just split it into these three major categories because that's all we cared about. So pacing, so back and forth in front of the exhibit, not visible, and other. So not visible means she went back into the indoor area, so you couldn't see her. And she has a choice all the time to be inside or outside. She paces inside, but where you can't see inside and outside at the same time. So she's the student standing on the outside. So just because she's not visible doesn't mean she's not pacing. She probably is pacing inside too. I can't tell you that for sure, but so in the time that this student watched her, so every minute she clicks what she's doing. So in the time that this student was watching her, 28% of the time she spent pacing at the front, 27% pacing, not is the other behaviors, and then not visible for 45%. Yeah, that's 100%, right? So what we did was, so what she was trying to do is look at different ways to break that pacing pattern. So because we know different types of enrichment do it, different feeding behaviors might do it, or different ways of feeding her, she tried different things. And the best one, or the most useful one, or the one that had the biggest effect, was using a rabbit. Was feeding her a whole rabbit that we would hang on this on a line that went across the exhibit. So she'd have to tear it down. It was inside of a bag or a box or something. So she'd have to tear it down off this line and then open it up, and then there was a whole rabbit. And the rest of the time she got just like raw ground meat or chicken, pieces of chicken, like smaller meals. So this would be her biggest meal. So what she found was when she would do that, she would pace 33% of the time. So if you remember, she was pacing 28% of the time, so that's probably about the same. But she was visible a lot more, so only 5% not visible. And then this other block is really interesting. So 62% other versus 27%. So that's a pretty significant increase in other normal behaviors, right? Being visible. So even though the pacing didn't change, we increased her behavioral diversity. So we gave her the opportunity to express more normal behaviors. So even though we didn't change the amount of time she spent pacing, we still increased her diversity and still gave her the opportunity to express behaviors that she wasn't expressing before. So that's pretty cool, even though we didn't change the pacing. So what we're looking at now is this idea of feeding bigger meals to carnivores. So maybe carnivores pace in the zoo because we feed them these smaller meals because we're trying to keep them from being obese, but we feed them smaller meals throughout the day, and so maybe they never get full, because in the wild they would kill a deer and gorge on it and then not eat for a few days. So maybe by feeding them these smaller amounts of food, they never get full. So maybe these animals are hungry all the time, and so they just pace all the time, looking for food, even though they have enough to eat. And so it goes back to what we were talking about before, from the animal's point of view. Even though it's getting enough nutrients to maintain, it's still hungry, it's still feeling hunger, because we're not feeding it in a normal way. And so she got a whole deer a couple of weeks ago, and I was out of town, but the keepers say she didn't pace the entire week after she had the deer. So we're looking at different ways to give her more of that type of thing. So this is a deer that was like roadkill, and when the police or the sheriff's office see it, they bring it to us. So this is really infrequent. And if you know this tiger, like to put a phone, so there's mesh between that picture. And so to put a phone like up to the mesh that close to this tiger, she's not like that normally. Like you can't do that. And see like how calm she looks just sitting there next to her deer. Yeah, right. So now we're looking at different ways to feed her more at one time. And maybe that means that we lose the opportunity to get close to her because we want to feed her like by hand and have that relationship with her so that we can inject her and do stuff like that. But maybe we sacrifice some of that and feed her sometimes all at once. Maybe she gets her 15 pounds all at once some days, or 20 pounds one day and then cut back the next day. In recognition of maybe that's what's important to her, or maybe that's what's driving her. So really looking at science and recognizing that what we do may or may not have the effect that we think it's going to have. So we provided more enrichment, and the pacing didn't change, but we still made a positive difference the way I'm interpreting it, which is really interesting. All right. So the next, so behavior. So we talked about physical health. We talked about behavior. And then the last part that we sort of underplay because it's really difficult to understand is the feelings part, the affective state of animals. And it requires, when we talk about feelings of animals, it requires critical anthropomorphism. Have you guys heard that term before, the critical anthropomorphism? Yeah, good. So anthropomorphism, is projecting or attributing human emotions or motivations to animals. So this idea of critical anthropomorphism was first described in the mid-'80s as sort of a reaction to the behaviorist point of view where you can't describe animal emotions or animal consciousness because you can't measure it. And really the same thing of really extreme behaviorists don't think you can talk about human thoughts or emotions either to describe behavior. And so this was sort of a reaction to that. And it's really that we as animals can use our minds and our experiences and our emotions to help us understand what a similar animal might be experiencing in a similar situation, recognizing all that we know about their natural history and their neurophysiology, and the similarities and differences. And so this idea of critical anthropomorphism is okay. And certainly anyone who has a dog knows that animals can feel happy, can feel sad, and so this idea of animals not being able to feel emotions is really not right. But it does require some thought to be able to really attribute that. And so the tiger is a good example of that. Oftentimes we get guests who say she's pacing because she's sad because she's alone, and that's not true because tigers are alone in the wild; they're solitary, and so that's not what she wants. And so we know that, and we can describe that based on their natural history. That's probably not what they want. That's what a person might want, but we can use critical anthropomorphism to know what's probably driving her. And when we talk about feelings, it really emphasizes the animal's experience in animal welfare. So really promoting everything that matters to the animal and not what so much matters to us. And going back to what we've been talking about with physical health, so in sort of the tiger, it's when we're talking about things like nutrition, providing a good diet to animals isn't that important for welfare, because it doesn't matter to the animal if they're getting the right nutrition or not. It's only that the feelings that they have after that of not getting it. So if they get proper nutrition and never feel hungry, then that's the hunger part is what matters for welfare. It's not that they're getting nutrition, it's that they're not feeling hungry. So that feelings part is really critical to welfare when we're talking about welfare. So really what we're going for is something beyond just what we think about when we think about welfare as a baseline thing. And we want to provide a life worth living. And so these positive affective states, which we would call happiness, are possible only after the basic needs are met, and the costs of it are sufficiently low. And so we can measure that, though, indirectly through some of these behaviors that only happen when animals have their basic needs met. So these are the bonus kind of behaviors that they can do only opportunistically. So those are the affiliated behaviors. So elephants that are suffering won't do this, won't touch each other this way. Sleeping. So this is that same tiger. This is at like 6 or 7 o'clock after everyone's gone on a summer afternoon. she's happy in that picture, right? I think we can all agree with that. Sleeping, playing. So play behavior is actually really interesting in animals. It's becoming a really popular area for research, especially in farm animals like veal, cattle, giving them the opportunity to play and using play as a measure of improving their welfare. Because they don't play, obviously, when they're by themselves, and you know how veals raise traditionally. So giving them the opportunity to play. And then paying close attention to anticipatory and exploratory behavior. So sort of, if you think of, again, using critical anthropomorphism, think of yourself right before a test that you know is going to be challenging. That anticipation is not a good feeling, right? And your behavior changes in relation to that. And as opposed to getting in your car after the test to go to the bar, that anticipation is a different feeling, right? That's better. And so your behavior looks different when that happens, right? So those types of, so looking at animals' anticipation of events, when we were talking earlier about like normal behaviors or normal experiences, things that happen to the animal every day, if those experiences are aversive, and you can tell based on their behavior whether they anticipate that as a normal experience as being rewarding or not, those are the opportunities for us to make a big difference when we talk about welfare. And then vocalization, so we traditionally think about vocalizations as being when animals are in pain or suffering, but there's a different set of vocalizations that happen when animals are happy that we can measure too and look at too. So we're really trying to maximize welfare through promoting happiness and giving them the opportunity to have choice and control over their environments. And another dimension of that is these keeper-animal relationships that's really important, that we know is really important. So when we're talking about choice and control, we're talking about giving them choice within a confined environment, right? And that's the same principle that they have in the wild, that they're in a confined environment, but they still have the opportunity to express different choices. And so this is our new snow leopard exhibit that we just opened in May last year. And so these two animals were introduced together, so they have the opportunity. This is there's one exhibit, and then there's a long chute with another outdoor area behind the scenes that these animals have full access to, but they have the choice to be together. And so they're choosing to sit next to each other when they could be really far apart. So giving them the choice and the option to get out of visual contact, out of physical contact with each other. And then what we were talking about earlier, one of the cool things about this exhibit is that there's no shade structures in it, but there's shade at different times and different places of the day. So on a hot day in the summer, they move around the exhibit. They use the whole space, finding where they want to be, which is something they would do in the wild. It's a really natural behavior for them to choose where they want to be. So they have control over that part of their lives. So certainly we can provide the opportunity for choice and control, and so similar to what we were just talking to the picture I showed you with the rhino, an elephant in this type of habitat or exhibit doesn't have much choice or control over where it is or what it does, right? And so we can all agree that's bad, and this animal has poor welfare, probably has poor welfare because it doesn't have choice or control. And I guess when I say poor welfare, I equate that with adequate welfare at this point. So even though all of this animal's basic needs might be met, that's not acceptable anymore. So what we want is something like this, right? And so these animals have the opportunity to be really happy. They're all foraging. There's a natural social group, lots of different places for them to be, opportunities for them to do normal behaviors, and make choices and have control over where they are and what they're doing in the environment in a way that this animal doesn't. Excuse me. Then something that we don't talk about, I think, enough in zoos is the importance of keeper-animal relationships. And as veterinarians, we often talk about the human-animal bond as being really important. And I like this human-animal relationship idea better because I think the bond word maybe is a little bit unhealthy sometimes, right? And so and we use it. This is my wife. She's a small animal veterinarian, so she has to make money off of that human-animal bond, right? And so in the zoo, we were talking about at dinner. In the zoo, this relationship idea is really important because we have to sell what we think and our ideas to keepers in a healthy way, right? But for the animals, these relationships are really important, and these relationships do promote really good welfare and really good happiness. I would say this is James. He's one of our really awesome keepers at the zoo in Rochester, who's developed such a good relationship with the lions. I did a physical exam on one of them over the summer, so needed to anesthetizer, and he's got them trained to come in for injections. It was a pretty significant amount that she let me give her, but not all of it. And just because of her relationship with James, she came back and let me inject her again. And so those types of experiences that really elevate her welfare, or elevate her experience as part of that exam, if she wouldn't have come back, I would have had to dart her. And so that would have been a significant negative experience for all of us. And so because he's worked so hard and developed that relationship, he changed the way that experience went for her in a really powerful way that we, I think, don't give enough credit for, that opportunity for really training to make a huge difference in their welfare and that relationship. So what we're looking at is sort of a more comprehensive approach to welfare, where we're really talking about animal well-being instead of just thinking about welfare, because we think of welfare in such a basic way. We tend to think of welfare in such a basic way. And so adding this whole other side of the things that we can put in to create an opportunity for animals to have good well-being, with environmental features like exhibits and social structure and all that. Really positive keeper-animal relationships, giving animals opportunities for choice and control over their environments and experiences, and then have that feeding into the opportunities for them to take care of themselves, for them to demonstrate positive behaviors or species-typical behaviors, and them to experience happiness. So it's really a more holistic, comprehensive approach where all of those different factors that we're putting in and really focusing on the output part and not so much the input part. And I finish every welfare presentation that I do with this quote by Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better, then when you know better, do better. I think it really summarizes what we're trying to do with welfare. We are all doing the best that we can based on what we know and what we've experienced. And as soon as we find evidence that suggests what we should do, that we should do something better, we should do it. And so we're always trying to move forward and raise the bar and continue to provide the best experience we can for the animals. So that's all I have. Thank you.
So Dr. DiVincenti, can you talk a little bit about what AZA is looking at from an accreditation standpoint relative to welfare?
Sure.
And it's brand new.
Yeah. So in 2017 or 2018, AZA, the zoo accrediting organization, came out with a new standard. It's 1.5.0, and it requires a written systematic welfare assessment. And so sort of intrinsically we've always assessed welfare in zoos, but then the standard requires sort of a systematic approach that's separate from like a physical exam or a veterinary check. And so there's a few components of it that requires it to be reactive and proactive. So what we were talking about earlier is like, in response to like events. So if you have like a nighttime event, so at our zoo we have zoo brews Friday nights in the summer when it's nice, and so they, our rhino doesn't necessarily like the band being set up right in front of him, and so having a process that's reactive to assess welfare given those challenges, and then a proactive process that recognizes if we move that band in front of the giraffe, they might not like it either, so let's set up an assessment ahead of time, or we're going to ship a giraffe from California to Rochester, and what that probably challenges that animal's welfare, and so having a proactive assessment process where we also look at every animal holistically at a routine standpoint. And then we respond to that. So that's a new standard, having a separate welfare process, assessment process.
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
About the penguin and the acupuncture?
Yeah.
Is it working? I mean, you just.
Ask Jackie.
Yeah. So Jackie is a certified acupuncturist, so she actually does it. I anesthetize the penguin. So we were talking about earlier the keeper that does it, that is the penguin keeper, is difficult to obtain information from sometimes. And to be fair, penguins don't give you that much, you know.
So you get into keeper welfare then? Huh?
Right. So he says, so I've been using like a chicken lameness scoring system, which is 1 to 4. So they're not changing in that. But when we first anesthetized them, so I guess I should preface when we did exams, so for penguins, it involved the keeper grabbing them, and they get West Nile, so we would vaccinate them, and then pretty much put them back, let them go immediately because they were like freaking out and screaming, and it's awful. So when we anesthetized her, the first one that we were going to do, recognizing that she had this really weird gait, was lame, we discovered that she had bumblefoot lesions on the bottom of her feet that would have been really difficult to see. Now when I examine them, they don't like it, but we lift them up. It's not as good. It's still not good, but anyway, so she has bumblefoot lesions, and that's sort of the most objective way that we've seen them get better. That we believe it's helping them, because these lesions were what they were, and then got better as we were doing it, and then we spaced out the treatments pretty far, pretty quickly, for lots of reasons, and when we anesthetized her again to do another treatment, they had gotten worse. Again, they backtracked, and now they're getting better again, now that we're doing it more frequently. So she must be walking better when she's getting it.
They changed the gait.
Right, exactly, because we're not changing anything in the exhibit. So, yeah. So I believe it's working, yeah. And he says they're eating better. We've done 2, and both of them, he said, used to stay like at the back of the group because we got like 40 penguins. So it's not totally his fault, but we can't keep track of one. So he said they used to stay at the back of the group at feeding time, and now they're like pushing their way forward. And so the median life expectancy for penguins, for African penguins, is like 15, 16. These birds are both 24-ish. I think the oldest one is like 35 or something, so they do live to be pretty old. They can live to be pretty old, but so.
And like objectively, like we watch them run up the stairs, whereas before they were just like climbing.
Yeah, they were like penguin waddling upstairs, and the one is at least hopping more. Yeah.
So do you take, that just occurred to me, the extended lifespan, does that figure into a measure of welfare?
Yeah, definitely. And so what we are doing as part of that standard is looking at animals that once they get to their median life expectancy in a zoo, we're really looking really closely at them and trying to be proactive about those animals that might be at high risk for things like arthritis, and trying to look at them closer and really have a heightened awareness of that they probably have that. Even though, and the other part of it too that's really difficult, even more difficult with zoo animals than dogs and cats, is that they can't tell us what they're feeling, and they're wild animals that are intrinsic to hide their pain. Most of them are prey animals that I'm dealing with, or live in these complicated social structures where if you're painful or disease, you're going to get hurt worse or picked on or whatever. So yeah, really trying to pay close attention to those animals and make sure that we're not missing something. And then something that we start doing is like treating them, even if they're maybe they're just a little bit off, but not really if you don't look at them that close. But it's a 22-year-old baboon. It's probably got some sort of arthritis. So let's give it something and see what happens. And so then you do, and then all of a sudden it's jumping around like it wasn't doing before. So it was probably pain, and we just couldn't tell. So yeah.
There's an art to it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
How do you think zoos are doing at communicating this to the public? And are there some things we should change or are changing?
Yeah, so that's something that we were talking about too. For whatever reason, I think we get really defensive about welfare, and of course we're doing the best we can, and of course you don't know any better. The guests that come to the zoo, you don't know any better, so don't question us. And so I think we for sure have to do better at it. And some zoos are really embracing it. And so the best example of for sure is Fiona the hippo. If you guys know about Fiona. And so how brave those media people at that zoo were, and the animal care people, to advertise it and then keep it open, recognizing that animal could have had a very different outcome. That would have been really, really sad. But they embraced it, and we're going to be as transparent as we can, and people responded to it in a really powerful way. And I think even if that animal had died, it would have made it, because the zoo was so transparent, it would have been okay. And so that's a risk, and I think we're a little bit afraid of that sometimes. And so I do think AZA, with this standard, with releasing this standard, is really trying to promote the idea of welfare and welfare science, and certainly like the Elephant Welfare Initiative, really trying to communicate that we're letting science drive our decisions and drive our program, and not projecting what we think is important. And so I think that the idea of transparency and talking about some of these things is really where we need to go. And I said I've worked at U of R in lab animal, and it's the same challenge there. And I think we have the same challenge with farm animals, that we're so defensive about it. And I think it's because we know, or we recognize somewhere inside, that what we're doing is maybe not totally right. And so I think being really transparent about, we recognize where we have issues and we're trying to make it better. I think that plays more to being real with people and saying, no, it's fine, don't look. So that's where I'd like to see us go, as being more transparent and recognize where our flaws are. And with elephants, and I think we've talked about this before, our elephants are 40 years old, and the median life expectancy for elephants in zoos is 36, I think. Yeah, so for sure, the median life expectancy of elephants in the wild is more than that. But we've only known how to take good care of elephants in zoos probably for 15 or 20 years. We haven't known that long what the right thing is to do for them. And so right now we have all these elephants that are in their 40s and 50s, and so once they die, the life expectancy will go up. If that makes sense, right? So we have all these young ones that died that are in the data right now, and once all the older ones die, it'll push it up. Once we start talking about that, if we would acknowledge that 20 years ago we didn't know as much as we know now, and now it's better, that's the story that I think would play better than everything's wonderful, and look at our beautiful elephant exhibit that we built. We should talk about the whole story, I think, and explain why we are who we are.
I want to go back just a little bit. A couple comments. One general, one really directed at the students. The fact that we do such a good job with the basics, free from disease, proper housing, proper diet, etc., creates a challenge for us that we have to pay at the other end. We have a huge population of geriatric animals that then we have to pay a different kind of attention to, and welfare becomes even more important. Looking at the thrive, not survive piece of it. So as we continue to gain more knowledge, just that piece, we're really good at keeping them alive, but we have a bigger obligation at the end then for that whole geriatric population. So it's important that we continue to look at this and really understand the science behind what makes proper wellness, proper welfare in a geriatric population, which is going to be different than in a population in its prime. Some of us are beginning to know that more than others. And then specifically for the students, the one comment about it's hard to get information out of the penguin keeper. You're going to find as you get out into the world and seek jobs, et cetera, that the hiring process is looking more and more and more at soft skills, communication, the ability to talk and interpret both to the public and to the management structure wherever you are. If you don't have those skills, you are at best going to be meeting